Mishmin Tuhis, Kanrakat Kanyon, Coyotewoman Sayers-Roods. My name is Kanyon. I come from Indian Canyon, the only federally recognized Indian country between Sonoma and Santa Barbara along central coastal California. That being said, we are on occupied native land. I am a Mutsunaloni woman, but can I hear you say awaswas? Can I hear you say Ohlone? And then here's a Mutsun word from my nation. Can I hear you say Ama Piritakawas? Ama Piritakawas. You're acknowledging the first language of this land. You're acknowledging the original peoples and the common phrase or the term that we currently are identified as Ohlone. And in the Mutsun dialect, you just said Ama Piritakawas, which means people of this land. You are people of this land, and you are acknowledging the indigenous peoples of this land. By having our community here, by inviting indigenous peoples to be part of the conversation and to share culture is one step towards honoring truth and history. My mother and my grandmother believe that when song, ceremony, and dancing stops, so does the earth. I too believe that. So I want to offer a grandmother song to honor our grandmothers, their grandmothers, and in all Mother Earth. For without them and without her, we would not be here. We share this time and space together for a reason, so it's with that humility, that gratitude, that present-mindedness that I offer this song here in this space here. And if y'all hear me clearly, can I hear you all say, oh? All right, it's a good way to send the song off in a good way too. So at the end of the song, a good oh is gonna feel good. So this is Kanyon's grandmother song. Moi moi o kawana, moi moi o ka, moi moi no, moi moi o ko, moi moi o ne. Moi moi hey yo kunale, moi moi yo kawano, moi moi yo ko, moi moi no, moi moi yo ko, moi moi yo ne yo kunale, moi moi hey yo kunale, moi moi. Welcome to Ohlone territory.
First of all, Kanyon, thank you very, very much for that. And I've given a lot of, this book came out in January, and I've given a lot of book readings in a lot of different places, and this one to me feels like the most important because I get to share the stage with these two people. So thank you both for sharing the stage with me, and it's me that's really honored to be here with you tonight. Thank you. And I'm already worked up. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Stan Rushworth. I met Stan literally when I was editing the final chapter of the book, and we were at a mutual friend's place down in Topanga, and something had told me. I literally was 10 days in front of my final deadline of the manuscript, and I had no idea what was happening. And I met Stan, and it literally completely changed the ending of the book, and since that time, my life. And I'll get more into that in my talk, but thank you very much, Stan, for pulling us all together. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight. It's a great crowd, and thanks to all the sponsors and to Cabrillo College for hosting this. I want to start with reading a short bit of a story that I wrote, also thanks to Stan and one of his dear friends who's in this story. And it's a story I wrote a little bit over a year ago, I guess almost 2 years ago now, and it came out just after the inauguration of the atrocity that is in office today. The title of the story is "For Native Americans, History Continues to Repeat Itself." So I'm just going to read briefly from this. Professor Emeritus and former chair of Native American Studies at University of California, Davis, Jack Forbes, writes in his book, Columbus and Other Cannibals, of what he calls the sickness of exploitation or the Wetiko cannibal disease. Cannibalism, as Forbes describes it, quote, is the consuming of another's life for one's own private purpose or profit. Forbes notes, imperialism and exploitation are forms of cannibalism, and in fact are precisely those forms of cannibalism which are most diabolical or evil. Few, if any, societies on the face of the earth has ever been as avaricious, cruel, violent, and aggressive as have certain European populations, Forbes concludes. Native Americans experienced Wetiko in brutal fashion, not long after first contact with Europeans. Quote, Europeans slaughtered, during one short period alone, 50 million buffalo because thousands of us relied on them, and in less than a generation, they annihilated them. Harold Dick Jr., a 72-year-old Chiricahua Apache, told me. And they take pride in this and take pictures of the dead buffalo, like it takes a real man to shoot an animal with a high-powered rifle from far away. He added that when Native Americans talk about great people, they usually speak of medicine people. Quote, but all of the greats the whites ever write about were great at destruction and subjugating people. Columbus Day. Ward Churchill said, the fate of Native Americans is the fate of the planet. So with reading Forbes' words and theirs of Harold Dick Jr.'s about Wetiko, and Ward Churchill's quote is the context for me of how we got here. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the science briefly of what's happening and how far along we are in the climate crisis in the context of what I just shared. And so I want to just briefly how this book came into being for me, because this is relevant. I'll come back around to touching on some of this towards the end of my talk. I was born in Texas, and for some reason, for a long time, I didn't understand why I always had this thing for the mountains. And I was always drawn up into the mountains. And at one point in my life, once I got old enough, basically started always orienting where I lived to where I was always in proximity to mountains, so I could always spend time in them. And so I was living in Alaska and actually up on Denali during the invasion of Iraq, and was completely outraged at what was happening, this vile, illegal, immoral situation. And I just felt this calling when I was up on the mountain, you need to just go there and write about it. And I didn't understand it. I had no idea how to make that happen. I'd never worked as a journalist. But I went, and that was 16 years ago next month. And that started a career in journalism for me and turned into 3 books and a lot of amazing experiences that dramatically changed my life, all of which factored into setting the stage for me writing this book. In 2011, I shifted over to climate reporting because having lived in Alaska, I was acutely aware, especially spending a lot of time in the mountains, as to what was happening with receding glaciers, dramatically disrupted climate patterns, et cetera. And then in 2013, I wrote, I'd been writing several articles about the climate crisis, but then in 2013, I wrote an article where really a lot of the dots were connected for me. And instead of looking at different aspects of what was happening to the planet in isolation, I started to get a more holistic picture, and that's when things really started to change for me. In short, it scared the hell out of me. I realized we are in big, big trouble. And what I started to realize, and that was really a first step for me in start of kind of getting some of the pieces put together, that there's an extreme problem here. And that started me in the process of, okay, I'm going to want to do a book on this similar to a couple of the books that I did on Iraq, which was, I want to go out to the frontline places where this is happening the most obviously and the fastest, and go out into these places with people who had long-term intimate relationships with these places, and then write about it from that perspective. And so a lot of the time that looked like going to Australia and going to the Great Barrier Reef with people who had been studying the reef for decades. It looked like going to the Amazon and going out into the rainforest with Dr. Thomas Lovejoy, who'd been studying it since 1965. It looked like going to glaciers in Alaska with people who'd been studying those glaciers for decades. Or it looked like going to St. Paul Island in the Pribilofs and talking with elders there, Anungun elders there, about the dramatic changes they'd seen in their lifetimes. And I have a whole chapter on that, really, which addresses how indigenous populations are taking these dramatic climate impacts the first and the most intensely on the chin. And the other place that I went, which I want to talk to you about tonight and go into more detail, because right now I feel like this is going to be indicative of kind of the next step of what's coming down the pike for us with the climate crisis, is a place called Utqiagvik. And many people will probably be more familiar with the name that it went by up until a few years ago, which was called Barrow, Alaska. But it was recently renamed to its native name, Utqiagvik. And for those who don't know, it's the northernmost town in Alaska. And I want to just start with reading a couple of pages from my experience there. The calm gray water of the sea fades in and out of the fog. Waves lap softly on the gravel beach as I hear the cries of seagulls, invisible in the fog. A figure appears in the distance, walking along the beach, then vanishes. Everything feels ephemeral as I take a morning walk along the shore of the Arctic Ocean. The only thing that is a constant is the shore beneath my boots and the crunching sound of the tiny stones as I walk. Up here, only 1,300 miles from the North Pole, in the summer when the sun never sets, time stretches until it loses its meaning. The fog rises. Low clouds scud to the west, coloring the tundra a brownish green. Occasionally, patches of light shift across the landscape. It is otherworldly, timeless. Utqiagvik, one of several ancient villages in the area, is the northernmost incorporated point in the United States. The indigenous people here, the Inupiat, have learned to live on the edge of the tundra and the seas with the whales, the birds, and the ice flows. While the precise meaning of Utqiagvik can be the subject of some debate, a sign in the town near the buried remains of the original ancient village site states that it means, quote, a place where snow owls are hunted. It is estimated that people settled here between 1,500 to 4,000 years ago, according to the same sign, primarily to hunt the bowhead whale, which appears at the village's insignia. Similar to the Anungun of St. Paul and other indigenous cultures, hunting and gathering is what binds friends, family, and community together and informs their spiritual traditions. To the west of the modern town, the ancient village's sod house mounds are still visible, but parts of them are disappearing into the sea, along with the summer sea ice and the coastlines. Climate disruption is making itself felt here too, and far more dramatically than most people would expect. So when I was up there in 2017, anecdotal evidence of the how far advanced climate disruption is already hammering this area was already very abundant. So picture a very, very small village, I think it was about 4,000 or 5,000 people that lived there. And it's right up on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, and it's on tundra, so it's built on top of permafrost. There's a dirt berm that had been built between the main core of the village and the Arctic Ocean. So that it's a 25-foot high dirt berm, and there was a big giant front loader operating there nonstop every day, 7 days a week, just constantly like pulling dirt from an area just behind the village, bringing it out, and then putting it on, maintaining this dirt berm. Right on the other side of that dirt berm, waves from the Arctic are lashing against it, pulling the dirt back out into the ocean. So it's basically being eroded, on a better day, slightly less quickly than it was being built up. Just below the dirt berm, you could look and see the big giant, further out there was a row of big giant, basically 50-gallon drums that they'd been filled with sand and put out there as kind of a maintaining wall, and those were basically mostly buried. In some places you could see the tops of those, and then a bit closer to the shore than those, the big giant canvas bags that can be filled with rocks or soil, a whole giant row of those set out there to try to slow down the erosion of the shore, to buy the village more time. Again, just barely the tops of those above, waves just going right over those and then hitting the dirt berm. So that was ongoing. And that's happening because as the sea ice is dramatically reducing, which it is now every summer now, usually at a record pace, there's bigger waves, which basically didn't used to exist because the sea ice, even in July, used to come up almost to the shore. Not far off it, you could at least see it. But it's gone so far out now that there are these big waves and storms that are literally eroding away the shore. Another aspect of that, even when I was there, central parts of the village, like the police station and the city hall, were already just within 50 feet of the actual ocean. So it's that close, not that many big storms away from literally core infrastructure parts of the village being eroded away into the ocean. Another thing that I was hearing from some of the local folks was that they couldn't harvest as large of whales because when they would typically harvest a whale, often they'd put them on an ice sheet and then start the initial butchering of the whale there before they brought it the rest of the way in. And they could only take smaller whales because otherwise the ice was already so thin that the bigger whales would just crash right through the ice, and they couldn't do it the way they've always done it. Another aspect was they had to be using bigger boats because there were bigger waves, because the sea ice had retreated further out, so the wind has more space to travel, hence bigger waves. So they had bigger boats and take smaller whales. When they would go out there in the late spring to set up and get ready to hunt, it used to take them 2 to 3 weeks to get all the way out on the ice and get ready to find a spot nearby some open water to catch whales. And now it would only take them, maybe a couple of days, because again, that's how fast everything is melting out up there. I also spoke with a man who was one of the grave diggers in the village, and he's, the permafrost, for anyone who's been to the Arctic knows this. It's just a few inches to maybe several feet below the surface, but it's very, very solid ice, and it's very, very cold, hence the name permafrost. And he said that it used to take him 3 days to dig a grave with basically a full-on rock pick, just a giant pick. 3 days of, full day's work, picking through the ice, making it big enough for a grave. And now he can do it in 5 hours because it's warmed up, it's more malleable, and it's that much closer to the surface. And again, when I was there, the ice was 250 miles offshore. And one of the elders I spoke with, who I'll read to you about in a little while, said that when he was growing up, in July, you could see the ice from the village. And now when I was there, it was 250 miles out. I'm going to read another bit of another experience. Richard Talak, who goes by Tokpak, was born and raised in Utqiagvik. He is 67 years old, and like all the elders here, is alert to the changes in the climate from when he was younger. Back then, it would be 45 or 50 below for weeks and weeks at a time, he tells me, while crafting a traditional ulu knife with a walrus tusk handle at a workshop. Nowadays, maybe it'll be 20 or 30 below for 2 weeks total. The workshop smells of bone dust, coffee, and cigarette smoke. It is filled with native men carving polar bears from fossilized walrus ivory, etching scrimshaw, and making knives and other traditional crafts. Tokpak says the sea ice used to come in by October, but now it doesn't come flush to the shore until November. On the very day I speak with Tokpak, a Finnish icebreaker set a new world record for the earliest transit of the Northwest Passage, setting off from Vancouver and arriving in the capital of Greenland, Nuuk, on July 29th. Tokpak's friend Perry Mutamit lives in the senior center next door to the workshop, and most days find him working on scrimshaw. Perry tells me that he never used to look forward to August when it would start snowing, signaling the end of summer. But now it sometimes won't start snowing until October. They have never had summers this warm before. Used to be we could see the sea ice from our house in the summer, but everything is off now. The ice is so small, he says while etching away on whale baleen. And even our hunting has changed. Just 3 days ago, we had a grizzly on the coast 18 miles from here. This isn't supposed to happen. It is another calm day with just a mild breeze. There are so many mosquitoes in the workshop that Perry finds someone to light a stick of mosquito repellent. It used to be windy all the time, he says. Tokpak comes over and mentions how in the good old days, they used to sometimes even have snow in July. We don't see that anymore, he says. Some more anecdotal evidence that I heard when I was up there. Thunder and lightning, to give you an idea how this never occurred up there. People didn't know what it was when it happened. And so the person who was telling me about it, who was actually familiar with it, said the first time it happened, which was recently, from when I was speaking with people there, that people literally ran outside to see what was happening. Well, you're in the permafrost, there's the tundra, there's no trees whatsoever. Obviously, it's very dangerous to be out there in a lightning storm. So other people had to go out there and find them and say, no, get back inside. It's not safe. You're literally a human lightning rod. Get back inside. So that gives you an idea that, this is something that never, ever happened there before. People just had no experience with it. Another example was a woman told me about that when she grew up, there was a baseball field that people would use, and they'd go out there and play games. And she pointed out the window, and that's what's there now, and it was the Arctic Ocean. It had already completely eroded away. There are new birds that they didn't have names for coming up there. They had hummingbirds, which they had never seen north of Fairbanks before, and this is significantly far north than Fairbanks. And like was just shared, grizzly bears on the coast, which never used to have grizzly bears up on the north coast. And they used to have polar bears on the coast, obviously in the winter, and sometimes they would be an issue in the village, and there are no more polar bears now in that area. So there's two aspects scientifically that are really, really important to understand about what's happening in the Arctic. Permafrost, as I mentioned, it's basically massive amounts of organic material that's frozen into the permafrost. And it contains the equivalent of what's estimated by current scientific studies between 1,400 and 1,850 gigatons of carbon. To give you an idea of how much that is, there's currently 850 gigatons in the atmosphere. So anywhere to nearly twice that amount to 2.5 times that amount that's in the permafrost. And as it thaws, it releases that carbon and a little bit of methane up into the atmosphere. The problem is it's called permafrost for a reason, right? but that's changing. I interviewed a man named Dr. Vladimir Romanovsky. He's a permafrost expert, Russian, based out of University of Alaska, Fairbanks. He's been studying it his entire life. He's a world-renowned expert. If there's an article on permafrost in the New York Times, you're going to see his name in it. And I interviewed him for my book, and he let me know at the time that since the 1980s, and this is not just in Alaska, but this is permafrost all through the Canadian Arctic and Russia, that just since the 1980s, measuring 1 meter down into the permafrost, which you would think, okay, that's a little over 3 feet. It's deep enough that temperature wouldn't change much. But 1 meter down, he's registered an increase of 5 degrees C warming since just the 1980s. So that means literally the permafrost, even well out of sight of the sun, is thawing rapidly. And even deeper than that, 20 meters down, he's seeing increases of 1 or even more C just since the 1980s. So the whole upper layer, even tens of meters of the permafrost, is starting to thaw out. More recently, even after my book was published, there was a story that was released, and Romanovsky was headlined in it, that they were already just this past summer, seeing thawing of permafrost at a rate that they didn't expect to see for another 70 years. That's how fast it's coming undone. Other things that I'd mentioned in the book, there's areas in Siberia, and this is well noted, and you can find pictures of them. It was pretty heavily reported in media in Russia, not so much over here, but these areas where there were these giant craters being found of literally, it looked like someone had dropped a bomb in the permafrost in parts of the Jamal Peninsula in Siberia. And Russian scientists went in, some of them were 200 feet deep. They went in and went down to the bottom and were finding very, very high concentrations of methane. So it appears as though giant methane bubbles underneath the terrestrial permafrost were already literally getting so concentrated and blowing off the top of the permafrost. And there was many, many areas where they were finding these craters. A very, very disconcerting sign. Another layer to this equation that's very, very important to understand is subsea methane deposits. So there are these things called methane hydrates that are frozen, the permafrost as it goes underneath the water of the Arctic Ocean. In most of the coastline around the Arctic, it's very, very shallow seas. And there's a massive amount of methane. I'll come back to these figures in a moment, that are trapped in that subsea permafrost. Methane, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a far more potent greenhouse gas than is CO2. On a 10-year time scale, it's 100 times more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So this is if we can have methane vented into the atmosphere, and it's going to cause dramatically more warming, much, much faster than CO2. And so I interviewed one scientist in the book. His name's Dr. Ira Leifer. He's a NASA-affiliated scientist, and he'd been studying methane in the Arctic for a long, long time, using NASA satellites to take readings all around the Arctic and far out into the ocean. And I cited a study of his that was actually published back in 2012, if I remember right, where, for example, in 1,000 square kilometer of ocean, it's normal to have 2,000 to 3,000 plumes of methane. This is a natural thing that happens in oceans. You can find it many, many places around the world where the Earth's just releasing small vents of methane naturally. So a 2,000 to 3,000 plume average, at least in the Barents Sea area where he did this study, over 1,000 square kilometer area. In his study, which was published in 2012, they had already found one area, 1,000 square kilometer area, where they had registered 60 million plumes. And it was in fairly deep water, several hundred feet. So this does not bode well. And basically what he said is, as you look at these Oceans are warming dramatically around the planet. The last 5 years, each year has been a record warm year for the oceans. And in the North Atlantic, as that ocean goes into the Arctic, goes up, it hits the Barents Sea first and then works its way around the Arctic. And his concern is that that could be a basically precursor or kind of preview of what's to come for the rest of the Arctic. And so as that water travels further around the Arctic, it also comes into the eastern Siberian Arctic shelf, which is a huge area, very, very shallow area. And that's where we get into the work of Natalia Shikova, another scientist studying methane. And I quote her and cite several of her studies in the book. And the one I want to bring to your attention is that she published in 2008, and she warned of a 50 gigaton release any time of methane that could happen from the eastern Siberian Arctic shelf. So to give you an idea of 50 gigatons of methane, that is the equivalent in CO2 of 1,000 gigatons of CO2. And again, as I mentioned earlier, to give you an idea of how big a deal that is, there's 850 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. So that study warned that we could effectively see a doubling of CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere at any time as things keep warming up and as methane starts being released in vast amounts up into the Arctic. Another idea to give you of how much carbon equivalent that is since 1850, there's been a total of 1,475 gigatons of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere. So it's basically in literally a very, very short time span of, we're talking maybe a day, you could see 2/3 the amount of CO2 equivalent added to the atmosphere. So when things are warming as dramatic in the Arctic as they are, that's why this is so important, because it affects the entire global system. Another reason I wanted to include this chapter in tonight's part of my discussion is that just literally last week, a report came out from a Russian research vessel that had scientists from many different countries, including the United States, that came across a 50 square foot area in the eastern Siberian Arctic shelf where they found, they said the ocean was boiling like hot water with methane. And the scientists said we had never, ever seen anything like that before. And coming on the end of another record summer in the Arctic in many ways, that's extremely disconcerting information. I want to wrap up Utqiagvik appropriately with just reading about a couple of pages from a chat that I had with the oldest man in the village. The clouds lay low on my last full day in Utqiagvik. Everyone I had spoken with in town kept telling me that I had to speak with 92-year-old Wesley Aiken, the village elder. I'm directed back to the search and rescue building where I'd been before, where I find him getting a haircut in the back room. After he finishes up, he slowly walks out into the main room, wearing a blue jacket and aided by a cane. He is always smiling, and I see his crow's feet behind his thick black frame glasses. Compared to when he was a child in the 1920s, almost everything has changed in Aiken's world. Back then, there were maybe 500 people in Utqiagvik. They used dog sleds to hunt and lived for the most part by traditional means. There were no jets, no phones, no snowmobiles, and it was far, far colder during the winter and the brief summer. All the ice is melting, he says, and just looks at me to let the weight of his statement sink in. He speaks slowly. He is from a world where there was never a need to rush anything. The ice used to hang around here all summer when I was young. The ocean is now eroding the coast. The waves are getting bigger and rolling into the coast. I think we'll have no more Point Barrow before much longer, he says of the thin northernmost tip of the coast just east of the main village. Aiken sees the ice as life, for without it, nothing is normal, least of all the hunting. Right now, we don't have life on the Arctic Ocean, he says, referencing the thinning ice. Just young ice in the winter these days. We used to have the ice out here through all of July. The ice would be close in. There was no boating along the coast because of the ice, even in the summer. And when the wind changed from the west, the ice would pack in here along the coast. Later that day, I would learn that hundreds of walruses had begun hauling themselves out of the Chukchi Sea onto land for want of ice. 2 years ago, more than 30,000 did so, alarming scientists and locals alike. We don't count on the walrus anymore because the ice doesn't come in here for them to be on, Aiken says. So we don't see them hardly anymore. They don't find any ice, so they hang around somewhere else. Sometimes we hear about them at other places or at barrier islands. Sometimes we find stranded walrus, same with the polar bears. He tells me the permafrost is thawing, that while it used to be only a foot below the surface, it is now 4 and even 6 feet down. I can see more green grass out there in the tundra, he says, pointing out the window. It's growing more grass. The weight of his years underscores all of what the scientists have told me. It's all changing, he says. Some people from the lower 48 and the rest of the world are worrying about us, but I don't know why, because we are not worried. We know this is happening. People before me were telling us this was going to happen. They knew. I don't know how they knew, but they knew. I listened to them. Then it started to happen. And now I just know it's happening, and I don't think it's going to stop. It's now far too late to avert a global environmental catastrophe. Last year, 2018, was the 4th warmest year ever recorded, with the only warmer years being 2015, 2016, and 2017. We're currently in the middle of what is on track to be the warmest decade since record keeping began. We're already in the 6th mass extinction event that industrial civilization has caused. We're injecting CO2 into the atmosphere at a rate 10 times faster than what occurred during the Permian mass extinction event 252 million years ago that annihilated 90% of life on Earth. Our current extinction rate is 1,000 times faster than normal and is faster than that of the Permian mass extinction. We hear things like the new Green Deal, or maybe the right candidate in the 2020 election, or things that won't be too bad, at least until 2100, or maybe geoengineering or some other kind of science is going to save us. None of these fantasies take into account the fact that we are already off the cliff, and every single one of them is trying to fix something that is not fixable. And I think more importantly than all of that, none of them address Wetiko disease. The oceans have absorbed 93% of all the heat humans have added to the atmosphere. If they had not absorbed all that heat, right now global atmospheric temperatures would be 97 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than they are today. Today's CO2 levels at 415 parts per million are already in accordance with what historically brought about a steady state temperature on the planet ranging between 4 and 7 degrees centigrade higher than they are today, depending on where you are on the planet. We've essentially done the injury to the planet. We're waiting for the planet to show the rest of the signs. The oceans are now literally overheating, deoxygenating, and acidifying. Insects, which are essential for the proper functioning of all of Earth's ecosystems, as they are food for other creatures, pollinators of the vast majority of the food we eat, and recyclers of nutrients, are in big trouble. And without them, humans simply cannot survive. A recent series of studies informs us there will be no more insects within 100 years at the current trajectory. Since just 1970, 60% of all mammals, birds, fish, and reptiles are gone. What would we call it if there had been a 60% reduction of humans since 1970? Many of the scientists I interviewed for this book, some of them IPCC authors, said that Best case scenario, if we stopped all fossil fuel emissions on a dime today, there's a minimum of a 3C warming already baked into the system with the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere and the amount of heat that's already trapped in the oceans. The IPCC's worst case temperature scenario is a 4 to 5C rise by 2100. I've also had IPCC authors tell me off the record that you can double those projections. It's pretty commonly known in the scientific world that the IPCC is a heavily politicized institution, and i.e. not reliable science. Meanwhile, the International Energy Agency stated that preserving our current economic paradigm virtually guarantees a 6C rise in Earth's average temperature before 2050. Shell and BP analysts expect the globe to be as much as 5C warmer, also by mid-century. So it is clear that we're in a nonlinear situation of climate feedback loops and climatic disruptions and their impacts. There can no longer be any question that life on Earth as we know it is ending. So it's this feeling, after hearing all of that information, is where I was when I was getting ready to edit the last chapter of this book. I mean, how do you conclude a book where basically what I just shared with you is the punchline? I had no idea. But that's when Stan showed up in my life. And we started talking, and he started sharing stories with me. And one of the things that he brought to my attention was, because I was obviously very depressed and like, what's the point of even, publishing this book? Things look so dire. I need to find a different way to be. And he reminded me of a very important difference between indigenous perspective and the settler colonialist mindset, which in the settler colonialist mindset is we're born with rights. What are my rights? But in an indigenous perspective, there's two primary obligations. One is to serve the earth, and one is to serve future generations. And so for me, I've had to keep that in mind when I look at what am I going to do and how am I going to be during these times, and really let go of maybe what are going to be the results of my actions, or if I've tried to change this and what if I fail, and really just focus more in on what is the right action for me to do, and how can I be most effective at this time serving the planet. And I think that really also opens up the door to taking real risk, really risking being absolutely true to what is in here and what do I feel really called to do at this point in history. Because business as usual is not going to change anything and not going to get the job done. Another quote that I like to share that I found really helpful comes from Czech dissident, writer, and statesman Václav Havel, addressing this hope versus hopelessness paradigm. And he says, "Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing, no matter how it turns out." So I want to leave you with two things. Again, thanks to Stan, and I'm going to read them to you from the book. Stan has regularly invited Indigenous elders to speak to his classes, especially about what is the right relationship to Earth. His students always ask the elders, "What can we do?" Henry Tyler, an Arapaho elder, would point a finger to his head and say nothing for a while. And then he would answer, "Use this," and smile. Everything he'd said for the previous 3 hours would provide tools for those who chose to respond, Rushworth explained. He gave so much to reflect upon that a finger to the head was a powerful statement. CeeLo Blackcrow, a Lakota Sundance leader and elder, would smile and say, "Think about it. That's up to you. I can't tell you what to do. Educate yourself, then you decide." Of this, Stan added, like Uncle Henry, listening to him for 3 hours would give an incalculable amount of information and food for reflection. The common message these men offer, Rushworth believes, is that each person must come fully into their own agency and from that place decide upon their proper course of action. Otherwise, simply following the lead of someone else would entail a lack of the kind of conviction needed for these times. So the thing I want to close with is a story. I'll just read it. Stan also brought this to me. I came to him from his mentor, storyteller Dr. Darrell Wilson, who was born into the Pitt River Nation in northeastern California. Wilson tells of Misa, a small but powerful spirit that inhabits Akuyet, a mountain that the white man calls Mount Shasta, located at the southern end of the Cascade Range in north central California. Misa is a spirit force that balances the earth with the universe and the universe with the earth. Wilson says that Akuyet is, quote, the most necessary of all the mountains upon earth, for Misa keeps the earth the proper distance from the sun and keeps everything in its proper place when wonder and power stir the universe with a giant yet invisible canoe paddle. Misa keeps the earth from wandering away from the rest of the universe. It maintains the proper seasons and the proper atmosphere for life to flourish as Earth changes seasons on its journey around the sun, end quote. The mountain, the story tells us, must be worshipped because Misa dwells deep within it. To climb the mountain with a pure heart and with real resolve, and to communicate with, quote, all of the light and all of the darkness of the universe is to place your spirit in a direct line from the songs of Misa to the heart of the universe. While in this posture, the spirit of man/woman is in perfect balance and harmony, end quote. For as long as Misa's instructions are followed with sincerity, society will be sustained. Its inhabitants will survive for the long term. The most important of all the lessons, it is said, is to be so quiet in your being that you constantly hear the soft singing of Misa. However, the story also warns that by not listening to Misa's song, the song will fade. Misa will depart, quote, and the earth and all of the societies upon earth will be out of balance and life therein vulnerable to extinction. When I heard that, everything made sense clearly with runaway Waitiko disease and global capitalism and everything that comes with that. The vast majority of people on this planet stopped listening or never knew to listen in the first place. And so before I think anybody can really decide what to do during these times and how am I going to use my life, it's imperative for me that I've had to go out and listen on a regular basis. And that's also, in retrospectively, how I was given the messages of what I needed to do, whether it was going to Iraq or doing this book or what I'm going to do next. It always came when I was out there listening. And the other thing that I've recently been reminded of, thanks to conversations with Stan, is, and that's my time, almost perfect, is that when I go out and listen, and when you go out and listen wherever your place is or however you do that listening, when I hear what I'm given from the earth, and I hear that, then I need to do what I'm told. No matter what it means, no matter how risky it is, or no matter what it might cost me, but then it's my responsibility to do what I'm told. So the two things I want to leave you with before I'll take a couple of questions is, where do you go to listen to Misa? I mean, is it in the mountains? Is it by this amazing ocean? Is it in the redwoods? Is it by a creek? Is it a lake? Is it meditating? Where do you go to listen to Misa? And when was the last time that you went there to listen? Thank you. So I've got about a few minutes for questions, and then I'll bring out the next. Yes, ma'am. I don't. She mentions the methane burp is how Natalia Shakova, who I cited there, talks about it. And I mean, it's a peer-reviewed study, so it'd be pretty hard to erase a peer-reviewed study.
I teach climate science here at Cabrillo College. So there is some details to that. She is very worried about it, but she doesn't have actual data to show that that is methane hydrates right below the surface. If you look at the stability of methane hydrates, they need to be at least 350 meters down to be under enough pressure to be methane hydrates. So the thought is that probably what we're seeing is not methane hydrates that are coming undone, but rather the fact that the sea level used to be much lower during the last ice age, and there was a lot of organic matter there, now covered by the ocean, which is warmer, and that now cut off from the ocean is generating methane as the carbon thaws, and so that will increase. But good scientists like Dr. Archer and many others are thinking that probably we're not in much danger of this huge burst. Now, the argument that they try to use is, oh well, but maybe what's happened is it's underneath this thin permafrost that's going to crack due to the warming ocean and then depressurize it. But because of the thermal properties of the permafrost, that it has to absorb enough heat, it isn't likely to do that forever.
Okay, so we might be, I'm going to move on to some other questions here. So we might be spared the burp, but we still have a serious issue with permafrost in the Arctic.
The rest of what you said is right on.
I'm aware of that. Next question. Go ahead.
So you speak of Rita Mesquita and the other gentleman that when you were in the Amazon, and about their concern. Ms. Mesquita apparently, from what I read, is like feeling that she's given up hope, if that's, and then others who feel angry about what's happening. So my question is, with your experience with the many scientists that you've been visiting with and taking testimony from, do you perceive a high level of fatalism?
Yeah, so the question is, do I perceive a high level of fatalism with the scientists, I presume, many of whom I've spoken with in the book. And there is. I mean, many of them are pretty, they have it's kind of a mix of struggling with the feelings that come up when, as Dr. Dan Faegre, one of the glaciologists in my glaciers chapter at Glacier National Park, said, yeah, it's really hard watching the thing you study disappear. So there's that sentiment. Another guy, Nate Stevenson, a USGS biologist actually in Sequoia National Park for my trees chapter, who said, yeah, I saw this coming back in the 90s, and I kind of did most of my grieving back then. And he kind of resigned to it, but was still deeply, deeply committed to doing his work and carrying on studying what he was studying. So there's kind of this twofold, how each one individually as a human processes the grief and everything that comes up with what they were seeing, and then really a really kind of dogmatic, but I'm going to keep doing this work because this is what I love and this is what I do. And it was, just like all humans, I mean, it was really across the board of how everybody was dealing with different things. I mean, some, that issue never even came up. They just didn't want to talk about it. Other people like Rita Mesquita, this amazing scientist down in the Amazon, was very, very open about her grief. And yeah, I chose to not have kids for a reason, and I think we're already doomed. And basically everything in between that. And there's been some, a lot of writing come out even in the last 6 months about how, depression is a big issue now with climate scientists and people that are really on the front lines watching what's going on and how fast it's happening and how far ahead of schedule most things are. That's a real challenge. Just like I think, any of us, watching this, and that's why I think it really, that bit that I talked about It's about taking the right action and kind of letting go of the results. The results have always been out of our hands anyway, but just like, what is the right action that I feel really called to take, whether it's being a scientist or whether it's, joining Extinction Rebellion or, whatever that right action might be. So I think that's for me. I just want to really remind everybody of that, because it's so easy to get utterly overwhelmed right now with all of this information and just the daily news for that matter, and imperative that I think each of us just kind of keep tapping into that. Really, what am I feeling? What am I being called to do from the earth, and what is my commitment to doing that, no matter what and regardless of the results. So on that note, I'm gonna go ahead, Peter. I'll do a quick one and then. Yeah, so dealing with grief, for me, just real quick, and this is the last thing I'll do, and then I think Greg's up next. But I've had to really, I've gone through deep depression while working on this book. I had a period where like 3 months where I was like, what's the point? And that's why, it was in the most important thing for me was like, okay, talk to other people about it, have community, and really deepen my own spiritual practice has been imperative. And that's where, for me, being out on the earth on a very regular basis. I live up in Washington State on the Olympic Peninsula, and I go out into the mountains ideally every weekend at least, and just like, okay, this is why I'm doing this, and this is what I'm fighting for, and I'm part of this, and this is part of me, and just going back out there and just re-tapping in and staying connected that way. And then the other part of it is just action, is just staying, okay, as we've heard, action is the antidote to despair, and just really, okay, what am I really, really committed to no matter what? And when I look at student strikes and things like people getting arrested en masse for Extinction Rebellion, it's like, if these people are willing to put that on the line, and especially the kids, then there's no time to waste. And I have no excuse to sit back and feel sorry for myself. So it's really important to deal with the grief and have the feelings and all that. And then it's also, okay, and there are these younger generations, and I'm committed to doing what I need to do, for them. Again, no matter what, damn the results. Thanks.